Today on the red carpet, celebrities proud to have Robert Davis, MBE, DL. I will explain what the MBEs and the DLs are later. He has had the most extraordinary career. He's been in politics for over 36 years, during which time he has actually broken records as the longest serving Councillor of Westminster and also the youngest serving Lord Mayor of Westminster. So let me introduce Robert. Robert, first of all, I just need to ask you, whilst you were running Westminster Council, which is basically the heart of London and the heart of the country, tell me, did you ever envisage this pandemic, this incredible year that we've had?
And we did a lot of planning for those terrible moments, particularly for terrorists and a terrorist attack. Having been at the centre of 7/11, we were very conscious that Westminster, the centre of London, as you say, the centre of the country, would be the prime spot for a major terrorist attack. So we did a lot of training, a lot of preparations for that big moment. We also planned for a flu epidemic. But a flu epidemic is very different to what we're going through at the moment. It wasn't as contagious. It was tended to be something that concentrated on older people. And therefore we made lots of plans, but nothing gave us the thought of planning for something like this, and the way it has affected everyday life and the way it has more or less closed down central London. And it's something that we should have done, I accept, but no one from national government to local government had thought of the impact that this has brought us.
Actually, I was interested to learn that you took charge of London after the bombings in July, didn't you? That big July bombings. We had terrorist bombings, and you were forced to take charge of it all.
Well, yes, I was number 2 at the time, and the leader of the council was out of London at a big local government conference in the north of England, and so when this news broke, I was in a meeting. And news came through of something happening in London, and when we realised the magnitude of it, and specifically when we realised a bomb had gone off in one of our underground stations, I rushed to City Hall and had to take control with the chief executive, because we had to plan. Don't forget, when an incident like that happens, the main services take over first. So you have the police, the fire authority, the ambulance service, the hospitals. They take control at first, but we had to be there to support them. We had to clean up the mess afterwards. We had to deal with the fact there was no public transport. The whole transport system closed down. And so we had staff at work in central town. How do they get home? We had children at school with parents desperate to find out what had happened to their children. How did we get the children home when the public transport and the roads had been closed? How we dealt with people who were just in a terrible state. So we had to come in and support everybody. And again, we had done a lot of training for that. And therefore we were able to do a lot and support people and set up, we took over our leisure centres, our libraries, so we provided accommodation for people, and it worked because of our training. And that's so we do plan and are trained to deal with big incidences. But what we're going through now and the longevity is something that no one had ever anticipated.
Yeah. And to go on to Boris Johnson, not many people know Boris Johnson as you know him. How is it that you know Boris Johnson so well? Run through your relationship with him.
I had a long-term partner. I was married to a guy called Sir Simon Milton, who had been leader of Westminster Council, and we met through the council, fell in love and married. Simon was then poached by Boris in 2008 to become his deputy mayor. And within a few months he became his chief of staff, and basically his lean-on man, his right-hand man. And Simon was renowned for basically holding Boris's hand as deputy mayor of London to Boris's mayor, and supported him. And so I got to know Boris through Simon, and learned a lot about how Boris operates. He relies very heavily on the people around him. He's a brilliant mind, a very kind and considerate person, and has a mind that that is actually very thoughtful. But he does rely on people around him and experts around him, and he listens to people around him. There is a lot of criticism of other prime ministers who wouldn't listen and make their own decisions. Boris does listen, and maybe that's his failings. He does listen to the experts and goes with the experts. So when the scientists and the medics are telling him to lock down, he will rely on their advice, and he won't sometimes prejudge their views. And so that people have to understand that it's often the advice of those experts that he relies on, and not necessarily what the press is saying or what pressure groups are saying.
But he's also extremely loyal. Do you think that's a good or a bad thing?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of his good things and bad things. I said what I learned from him. He is very loyal to the people around him, and he finds a great difficulty in sacking people. There was an amusing incident when there was a senior figure at City Hall in London when he was mayor, who was terrible at his job, and my Simon, when he was deputy mayor, kept promising him that he would, you must sack this guy, and Boris just couldn't come around and do it, and it wasn't until things changed that Boris eventually did sack this individual, but he found it difficult because he didn't want to put someone out of work, and even though the guy was not doing a good job. And in some senses, he's loyal to people. He understands the implications of sacking someone, but it sometimes has adverse implications.
But I found the most touching was that he was such a good friend to you and Simon, that he was actually with Simon on his deathbed when he died of leukemia.
Yeah, as I said, Simon sadly died in 2011 from leukemia, and Boris was with us. I mean, what had happened, Simon had deteriorated over a number of days, and we were around his hospital bed, and the doctors had warned us that this was a matter of time. And so his mother, his sister and I were sitting around the bed, and I got a message that Boris wanted to come and be with us, and he arrived, and he sat with us, through the end, and for an hour afterwards, consoling us. He was very kind, and afterwards, after Simon had died, he would regularly make sure I was okay. He would take me out for dinner, took me to the theatre. He was a very good friend and very supportive on those difficult days after Simon's untimely death.
Yeah, we'll move on. We won't talk about sad things anymore. I wanted to talk about, you were the youngest Lord Mayor of Westminster, which was an incredible thing to be. In fact, the Lord Mayor of Westminster makes you, first most important after the Queen and the royal family, which I found is quite incredible.
You're the first citizen of Westminster. Only members of the royal family, the Queen or anyone representing the Queen, takes precedence to you. And it was brought home to me that here as a young man in my late 30s, from a middle class background, and here I was in Westminster Abbey one day for the Commonwealth Day service when there was a procession out of the Abbey in seniority, and the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh led the procession. There was me in my beautiful robes flowing behind the Queen and the Prince Philip, and behind me, in an inferior position, was the Prime Minister, John Major of the day. So I stood there and processed, thinking, where have I come to? Here I am, and I'm like, only the Queen takes precedence to me. So, and the Prime Minister had to stand behind me. It was quite a moving moment.
It was 1996, and you had the most extraordinary year. I mean, the year you had was amazing. Tell us some of your highlights.
Well, everyone says to me, what was the highlight of being Lord Mayor? And I think I can put it down to one thing in particular, and that was the state visit of Nelson Mandela, then the President of South Africa. And he was then at the height of his being famous, of his power, of his people being fond of him. And he arrived, and I spent quite an amount of time with him. And one of the stories is that he decided he wanted to plant a tree in St James's Park, and because he's an early riser, he wanted to do it at 6:30 in the morning. Okay, I had a car, as a chauffeur-driven car as Lord Mayor, so I was picked up at the crack of dawn, and we drove to St James's Park. And at 6 o'clock in the morning, it was throbbing with people waiting.
Really?
Absolutely, it was as if it was a major state occasion.
Wow.
And we get to this position in the park where this tree was going to be dug out and planted. I waited, and the President arrived on foot from Buckingham Palace. And again, crowds live on breakfast TV. We started the ceremony. He started digging and filling in the soil into the tree that we were planting, and he didn't stop. And I said to him, "Sir," I said, "Your Excellency, I'm sure you can stop now. There's two very large gentlemen over there, and I'm sure they can finish the job. And he stopped. He put the fork down, and he turned to me and says, "My Lord Mayor," putting his hand on my shoulder, "My Lord Mayor, I was always taught when you start a job, you finish it."
I love it.
And I felt humbled, and he finished the whole job. He didn't stop, and that put me in my place. But I said that probably the best thing I did was the night before that, because the Queen gave a state banquet in his honour, and I had the honour with my Lady Mayoress to attend this wonderful state banquet. My Lady Mayoress wearing a tiara, myself in white tie, wearing the mayoral insignia, and that was a very special occasion. And of course, when I was presented to the President by the Queen, she said, "This is our Lord Mayor of Westminster," and he said, "Oh, I know, I met him earlier today." So it was very nice. And one of the funny little instances was my Lady Mayoress was, this was during the actual banquet itself, she was busy talking to her neighbour. And all of a sudden, a flunky, one of these liveried waiters standing behind her, whispered in her. He said, "Madam, if you're not careful, your necklace is about to fall in the soup." And she was so relieved to find the necklace had actually come apart and was about to,
At a royal occasion, that could have been very, very.
But I think another little instance that was a wonderful occasion was on the final day of the state visit. He was going to do a walkabout in Trafalgar Square. And Trafalgar Square was absolutely packed. I mean, you couldn't move. And my mother at that stage was very ill. She was sadly dying of cancer and was to die a few months later. And she wanted very much to come. So I'd arranged with the palace for her to come and join me. But on strict instructions, she had to keep out the way. So we arrived and she stood by the barriers out of the way. And because he was a head of state arriving, we had to have a royal to greet him first. And so Prince Andrew was there to greet him. So the royal car arrives with Mandela. Prince Andrew receives him, then presents myself as the first citizen. And he says, "Can I present the Lord Mayor of Westminster?" And Mandela says, "I know who he is, but I bet he's forgotten who I am." And so I walked with him and Prince Andrew towards the crowd, and Mandela saw my mother and she didn't know who. And he said to me, "Who's that?" And I said, "That's my mother, sir." And he went straight up to her. She, thinking, "My God, I'm going to get into trouble because I'm in the way," tried to move out the way, and he put his hand around her shoulder and says, "No, I want to talk to you." Aww. And he had a little chat to her. And this was all live on television.
Oh, that's so nice.
And then he moved on to talk to the crowd, and I thought that was a very special moment in my life, very special.
Did you learn anything? Because having been in such close proximity, so many people are nowhere near this guy and they just see him from afar. What did you learn? He was such a humble, amazing man.
Well, something I did learn, and I watched that in Trafalgar Square in particular, was the way he would go up to the members of the crowd and he would take them by the hand, both hands, so they'd offer a hand and he'd put his hand around both sides, both hands, and he'd look straight in their eye and he would say, "I'm so honoured to meet you." When of course they were just humbled to meet him. They'd say, "Oh no, but we're honoured and pleased to meet you." And the way he did it so sincerely, I never forgot. And so when I used to go up to functions as Lord Mayor subsequently, so for example an old people's home, a school, some visit, I would do the same. I'd copy him, I'm afraid, cheated. I copied him and I would go up to people and hold them both by the hands and look straight in their eye. Many politicians never look you straight in the eye.
It's true.
And look straight in the eye and say how humbled and honoured I was to meet them. And they would melt and you knew you had a friend for life.
Well, I have to say, when the chips were down and when a Conservative Party looked like they were about to lose, you actually managed to gain your majority. So you're obviously doing something right, because your incredible amount of followers that you have in the residents in the area.
Well, I used to have to get elected every 4 years as a councillor, and I worked it hard. I did over 36 years as a councillor, and you build a reputation and you do good work. You make sure people know about that, and you canvass and you knock on doors and you meet people over the years, and people remember you. And there's some people, I remember some of my friends who were supporting me who knocked on someone's door. And the woman said, "Oh, I'm definitely voting for that Robert Davis." And she brought them in and found a photograph of me framed on her wall that I'd helped. It appears, I don't remember her, but it appears that I'd helped her years before. And she was so grateful that she'd found a photograph of me, framed it and put it on her wall. So I was quite touched by that.
Well, being in the planning committee, well, head of the planning committee for London, Westminster, which is the city of the world, one of the cities of the world, I know you've done a lot to beautify London and to make sure it's remained beautiful. You have a very important to you. What's your main...
I'm very proud of some of my legacies of way I think I've helped and supported central London. I had two roles. One was head of planning, so a substantial number of buildings got planning permission through me. I chaired the planning committee and led the negotiations on developing these buildings, and so I'm very proud of many of these fantastic buildings, many of which have won awards. But I've also was responsible for public realm, major public realm schemes. Now I'm talking about streets. So, for example, I had the initiative of making Baker Street two-way. Baker Street had been a motorway. Gloucester Place and Baker Street were one way each, and they were like motorways. And we turned them into two-way streets, calming the traffic, reducing the amount of traffic because they could now use both streets. And you widen the pavements, you make it much nicer, nice street furniture, and they are beautiful places now. Now, one or two people have complained to me they get confused by the two-way system, but that's because they're not used to it. Once they get used to it, it actually really works. And the other example is Bond Street. We did a major scheme that only finished about 18 months ago, where we widened the pavements and made beautiful quality pavements and some public art down there. And it really befits a street as important as Bond Street. But we did squares as well. Hanover Square is about to be finished, where we've made that a much nicer, beautiful square. I was very involved with Leicester Square. I originally started that when I first became a councillor. My first job in the early 1980s was as chairman of the Leisure Committee, and I was responsible for Leicester Square as a garden. And it was a road around it. People forget it was actually open to traffic. And I had the idea of closing it to traffic and pedestrianising, but leaving the square in the middle. And then about 10 years ago, we decided to refurbish the square. We took down the old railings and brought in some fantastic new silver, beautifully designed railings. We made it really a beautiful square, and I'm very proud of that. And I led that project, and on budget as well. Most of these projects came in within budget, which is very important in local government.
Yeah, also you're involved in the theatre. I mean, you always say you would like to have been an actor, but how did you therefore fulfil your role in theatre?
Well, they say, as I said, all politicians are failed actors, and I'm certainly a failed actor. And so I became a politician. I wanted to act at school and university, but when I was at Cambridge University, I soon realised I was competing with the footlight stars, people like Emma Thompson and Stephen Fry, who went on to be great, successful actors. And I realised early on that I wasn't going to be able to compete, so I turned to politics. And most politicians are performers. So I love theatre, and so when I had the power and ability as a leading politician to support theatre, I was able to do so through the West End. And the West End, of course, is the heart of theatre, the theatre world. About 85-90% of the most important theatres are in Westminster. And so I started working with the theatre owners, people like Cameron McIntosh, Andrew Lloyd Webber, and Nika Burns, who own about 70% of all the theatres, and supporting and helping them. And I've done a lot to work with them. And in my own way, I got involved with one particular theatre, which is the Regent's Park Open Air Theatre, which is a beautiful theatre without a roof in the middle of Regent's Park. And I joined the board of that in 1986 and still continue on the board today. And I chaired the board for 10 years, only retiring last year after my time limit expired. But the way I've tried to help and support theatre is by finding more theatres. Because one of the things that make London special in normal times, it's difficult now through COVID, but in normal times, it is London theatre that bring the tourists to London in the hordes that they do come. And so I always wanted to support and try and produce more theatres. And so the first time this happened was when there was a theatre in Victoria called the Westminster Theatre. But it was an old 1930s building, but hadn't been used as a theatre for 25 years, and it'd been bought by moral rearmament and used as a form of church. And then mysteriously one day it burnt down, and it was left derelict for years. And a developer bought it and wanted to turn it into flats. And I insisted he put a theatre in there. And reluctantly, he, as part of the planning condition, he agreed to put a small 300-seat theatre in there. And then he kept coming back to me and saying, it's not viable, I can't afford to put the theatre in there, can I please get rid of it? And at one stage he even offered me £100,000, not for me personally, but for the theatre world, to a fund to support theatre. And I said that would just get disappeared and be forgotten about. I want a theatre. And so we agreed the compromise was he could build another floor in return for him definitely building us a theatre. So he jumped at that. A year later he comes back and says, it's still not viable, I need to drop the theatre. So we agreed on another floor. And the third time he came back and said to me, look, I'm afraid it still doesn't work, I need to drop the theatre, even though he'd got his 2 extra floors of flats. I said, no, I said, I'm not giving you any more floors, you've got to build that theatre. If you don't, you're going to have to go bust, because I'm not going to change it. That's what the policy is, you've got to do it. And eventually he found the funding and he built it, and the St James's Theatre has now become the Other Palace and a very, very successful 300-seat theatre. So with that success, I had another idea, because there was a theatre called the Astoria in Charing Cross Road. And it'd been a theatre in the 50s and 60s. In fact, it was built as a factory, a pickle factory. And then it being converted into a dance hall. And my late grandmother used to go ballroom dancing in the 30s. And then it was a theatre for about 20 years, finished being a theatre in the, I think, 80s, and it became GAY, a gay disco. It had to be demolished, because that's where the Crossrail station was going to be built, for the Tottenham Court Road station, for the new Crossrail, the new line under central London, the railway line, which is not yet open but is about to be. And so they compulsorily purchased the building, demolished it to build this massive hole underneath. And then the owner, a property company, was going to get the land back once they'd finished building underground. They give him back the flat surface and say, here's your land back. And so he came to see me, the developer, about 5-6 years ago, to say he wanted to build an office building on top. And could I, to start discussing with him the planning consent. So I said, well, when he showed me these plans, I said, where's the theatre? What theatre? I said, there used to be a theatre here. I was, telling a little white lie, because there'd been a theatre for 20 or 30 years, but not consecutively. And he said, oh, I said, yeah, I want a theatre. So he came back with a 100-seat little theatre. And I said, well, that's not viable. From my understanding of the theatre world, you have to have at least 300 seats to make it commercially viable. So he reluctantly came back with a 300-seat theatre, which was the same size as the Other Palace. So I knew that it worked there. And then I said, who's going to operate it? He said, I'll get some community group. And I said, well, look, there are no community groups, theatres now, that can run a theatre in the West End. It's just not commercial. I said, you need to get a commercial operator on board. Well, I don't know any. So I said, well, I do. So I went to see Cameron Mackintosh, and I asked him to look at it. And he did, but he said, look, this is too small. He does the big musicals, and 300, you can't do a musical for 300 people. So he said, no. So I went to Nika Burns. Now, Nika owns about 6 or 7 theatres. She's a big theatre producer, but she also owns many of the West End theatres. And she liked the idea, because most of her theatres do straight plays, and so you do a small audience is quite fine. Anyway, I introduced her to the developer, and the long and short of it is they got on well, with me trying to be the matchmaker. And now in 2020, they are building, and almost next year I think they will open, a 700-seat theatre in the round. It will be the first purpose-built West End theatre for about 40 years. And it's very, very exciting, and I am very proud of that. And that is probably one of my greatest legacies of all my years in local government. When it opens next year, hopefully I'll be there, and I'll be very proud that that's there, a new West End theatre, because of my obstinance in making them build a theatre.
Robert, you are a DL and an MBE. What is actually an MBE, and particularly what is a DL?
Well, first of all, Laura, MBE is an honour given to me by the Queen. It's part of the honours list. I'm a member of the Order of the British Empire, and it was given to me for my services to local government and planning in particular. And I had the honour, it was about 4 years ago, and I had the honour of receiving it at Buckingham Palace from Prince Charles. And I know Prince Charles a little bit because of his interest in planning and I had several meetings with him about certain big planning issues. And in fact, he once took me down to Poundbury, his model village in Dorset, to show me around, me and a few other people. And so when I went up at the palace to receive the MBE, the medal, he said to me, "Oh, Robert," he said, "I can't believe it's taken so long." So I said, "I agree, sir." But that's my MBE, and I'm great honour to have received that. I think I'm the only local government councillor in Westminster to have received an MBE for my services to Westminster. Other councillors have had honours for outside services, things they've done outside Westminster, and a few leaders have either been knighted, like my Simon, my late partner, and other leaders have received a peerage or something, but no other councillors received an honour for being a Westminster councillor. So I was quite touched by that. Being a DL, that's another great honour. That is, I am one of Her Majesty's Deputy Lieutenants for Greater London. And in each county in the United Kingdom, there is a Lord Lieutenant appointed by Her Majesty, and he is her representative in that county. And they have a whole wide-ranging responsibilities. But more particularly, it was historically set up to raise armies for the monarch and to raise money. They were often originally levied taxes. But historically, they don't raise armies anymore, although they do liaise with the military in each of the counties. And to support their work, they have a number of deputies which get appointed. And so I'm one of the Lord Lieutenant of Greater London's deputies. And when a royal goes on a royal function, they have to be greeted by the Lord Lieutenant or one of the deputy lieutenants. And so one occasionally has to roll up and do my duty as a deputy lieutenant. But it's an honour, really, for my services to London.
That's quite. Is it a lifelong honour?
Yes. Well, you're active until you're 75, but you can keep the initials DL after your name once you've retired. But yes, I'm still not yet 75. Would you believe it?
Oh, I believe it. In fact, you're so young looking. You've got some funny stories about. You looked 14 when you were already a councillor, which caused a lot of problems, didn't it? Because you looked so young.
Yeah. I mean, when I first got elected, I didn't look old enough to be a councillor. I was 24 and looked, as you say, 14. And I had an officer come in to visit me at my home for a meeting, and he rang the doorbell and I answered it. And he said, "I've come to see your father." And I said, "Sorry, my father doesn't live here. Who do you want?" He said, "I've come to see Councillor Davis." I said, "That's me." So he was a bit embarrassed by that. And then in those days, we didn't need any security passes. You didn't have, security passes in the early 80s. And so anyone could walk through City Hall and walk into City Hall and walk anywhere. And often late at night, I'd be walking around after a meeting and I'd get stopped by some security guy saying, "What are you doing here in the building?" And when I said I was a councillor, I don't think they believed me. So they actually made me a pass, proving I was a councillor. And I was the only one because nobody believed me. But of course, sadly, nowadays, you can't move an inch without some security pass allowing you to go through. But in those days, times were different. And so now I rather like it. I mean, I used to get very upset because I was trying to be treated seriously as a politician, as a young 24-year-old, and everyone thought I was a kid. But now I rather like it when people think I'm younger than I am.
Well, you do look a lot younger, considering that you've done so much in your life, and considering you've done so much in your life, then it's not surprising you've just written your autobiography. It's in its first stages now. So what's happening with your autobiography?
Well, I've decided now I've retired from local government and from my career, I've decided to spend lockdown writing my autobiography and putting pen to paper. And I've just completed it here in Mallorca. I've 200,000 words, which is a doorstop. And I've got to now edit it and work on it, but I'm really excited by it, and it allowed me to think about my past, my history, not only about me and how I got involved in politics, and the lucky things that happened to me, and the interesting things that have happened to me, but also life of being a councillor for 36 years, and what it was like at the heart of local government in central London, and very exciting, and I hope people will find it interesting, as well as some of the interesting people I've met. For example, Nelson Mandela, as I've described earlier.
The Queen.
And the Queen and Prince Charles. But one of the amusing things I found was that I remembered, having done a bit of research, that in the early 1990s, I was asked by the then leader of the council to lead an environmental project. And so I created something called the Westminster Initiative. And here in Westminster, we decided that we would do a number of greening initiatives. For example, I decided to push for recycling. Now, you have to put this in the context at the time. Well, if we take it all for granted now, no one was recycling or greening or planting trees and flowers in the early 1990s. And so when we were pushing recycling, we were the first council to do that. We were talking about keeping the streets clean. We were talking about planting plants and trees and flowers. When I planted beautiful red geraniums down the centre of Park Lane, it was criticised, and it was called municipal planting. But it won award after award, and it's still there every year. And so, we were at the forefront of the Green Initiative. And I used to go around talking to other councils about what we were doing and encouraging them to do it. And it's taken for granted now, but it wasn't all those years ago. So, times have moved on, and I like to reflect in the book about some of the exciting things I did and was around at, during some important times in the life of Central London.
Tell me a little bit about Sir Simon Milton. Obviously, he was your partner, but since his passing, you have ensured that his legacy is forever with us. How have you managed to do this?
Yeah, I mean, I call it the Marilyn Monroe syndrome. He died at the height of his power and his people supporting him. He was a very powerful, very intelligent guy, and he had been leader of Westminster Council for a record-breaking 8 years. He was knighted for that work. He became the chairman of the Local Government Association, which is the national body that was responsible for local government. And then Boris poached him to become his senior deputy mayor and chief of staff. And people, including David Cameron, recognised him as the person who kept the Boris on the steady path and supported him. And he died, unfortunately, very suddenly, having had leukemia, and some of the implications and consequences of having a bone marrow transplant weakened his immunity, and sadly he died. He actually died of pneumonia, but caused by the weakness of the immunity system from the transplant. And as a result of dying at such a relatively young age, at 49, at the height of the respect people held from him, a lot of has happened to recognise him and what he did for London. So we have set up a foundation, the Sir Simon Milton Foundation, which has raised millions for various charities, charitable work. For example, we do two main things. One is Silver Sunday, which is the first weekend in October. And we organise, in a normal year, this is different this year, a normal year we organise about 1,200, 1,500 events throughout the country. We don't organise them, we facilitate them, where people invite older people out, people who are lonely and isolated, to an event free. So it's a tea dance, a show, a recital or something, and it's wonderfully received by the old people. We also deliver food parcels at Christmas time, hampers. And these are hampers not of champagne and caviar, but of things that people need. And this year, because of COVID, and we can't really invite the older people to a function, we're getting all these councils around the country distribute boxes of afternoon tea packages of cake and biscuits and some tea. And so they're going to get something. We're going to do some virtual stuff, but it's difficult because a lot of older people don't use virtual and computers and phones, etc. But we also work with young kids and try and get them into employment. And so we set up a school, the Sir Simon Milton University Technical College in Pimlico, which is now educating about 300-400 young people to become engineers of the future. So it's a school specifically training young people to become engineers. And that's that. We've also have a number of statues throughout London that recognise Simon. This is because several people approached me and said, we would like to recognise Simon's greatness and what he did for London. And so my favourite is the one right next to the Mayor of London's City Hall on the South Bank near Tower Bridge. And there is a twice life-size statue of Simon produced by a famous sculptor, probably the greatest living sculptor of people, Philip Jackson, who did the statue of the Queen Mother in the Mall, the Queen at Windsor. He did the Gurkhas monument. He's done some amazing monuments, Gandhi in Parliament Square, and he's done this absolutely amazing likeness of Simon. I mean, when I saw it in the studio, I walked in and saw it for the first time. I thought it was Simon sitting there. It's so lifelike. And that was unveiled by Boris. about 4 years ago. There's that. There's another statue of him, a smaller one, life-size, of him sitting on a bench in Paddington, because Simon was very much involved in the redevelopment of the whole Paddington Basin, and that recognises him. And there's also a bust of him in Piccadilly Circus. When I first met him, he was living in Piccadilly Circus. His father owned a shop there, and he lived in the grotty flat above before I persuaded him to move out. And when they were knocking down the building, they applied for planning permission, and I considered the planning application and this public meeting as a joke, because Simon was well and didn't think it was going to be the end for Simon. I said, when we granted permission for the building to be demolished and rebuilt, that one of the conditions they should call it Milton Towers. It was a joke, and no one took it seriously. But when Simon subsequently died about 2 years later and they were about to build it, they came back to me and said, well, actually, you joked about Milton Towers. We actually want to do something to recognise Simon and what he did for London. And so we ended up with a bust of him on the outside exterior wall of the building. And behind him, this is actually not a sculpture, this is a carving by someone who used to carve gargoyles and churches. And it's a wonderful carving out of stone. And behind him, behind his relief of Simon, there's the Mayor of London's City Hall, Westminster Council City Hall, and the college at Cambridge where he was. And because his parents' business was patisseries, they had a chain of patisserie shops. In the foreground, carved in stone, is an eclair and a slice of cake. And the funny thing was that when it was almost finished, it was put in place and there was scaffolding up, and the sculptor was up there finishing it off. And we went up there and I said, I thought there was a little bit too much hair. It was too thick. Simon, sadly, because of his transplant, had thinner hair towards the end. And he started chiseling away to reduce it, and I thought, oh my God, I better not sneeze, because if I sneeze he might chop off his ear by mistake and would have Van Gogh, not Simon Milton. But it was okay.
I've really enjoyed talking. I'm sure everyone's going to be excited to listen to what you have to say, read your book. And so may I say thank you so much for coming, thank you for sitting on my couch, and thank you so much for being here with Celebrity. Until next time, thank you.